This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about who we are. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today's episode concludes the 5-part series on the human brain. Now, why not, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, this is a great place to jump in. But whether you have listened to them or not, I probably don't need to tell you that science, during the past years, during the past decades, has learned a lot about the human brain. And on the one hand, this is an episode about that, about the story of how the human brain learned to understand so much more about itself. But this is also an episode about the limits of neuroscience. Indeed, with all the knowledge that we have about the brain, how well do we actually understand our brains? Are we close to cracking the neural code? Is a groundbreaking theory of consciousness just around the corner? My guest today, Matthew Cobb, thinks that the answer is not so. Cobb has had a long career as a neuroscientist himself, but he's also the author of The Idea of the Brain, The Past and Future of Neuroscience, a wonderful book about the history of the field, from the very ancient beginnings till the present day. And having this kind of day-to-day experience himself, but also having the bird's eye view of a historian, Cobb is really able to both see and communicate some patterns that are very difficult for everyday people to appreciate in a world always thirsty for news about the next big discovery. And whether you agree with him or not, he is a wonderful storyteller, and this is a very rich episode with a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories, and a lot of very deep reflection about the capacity of the brain to understand itself. I hope that you enjoy this. If you do, you can show support to the show. You can just subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Give the show a 5-star review if you think that it deserves it. And you can share it with a friend if you think that they might enjoy it. But before further ado, let's get started. As always, I just want to say a warm thank you to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much. Your support means a ton, and this episode, as always, is for you. Now let's go. Professor Matthew Cobb, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
When thinking about the human mind, human consciousness, and trying to find a biological basis, whether we understand it or not, we are pretty confident that we should look at the brain. But this itself, it's not the obvious thing. It hasn't been the obvious thing throughout history. How and when did we start looking at the brain instead of the heart, for example?
I mean, it took a long time. And the reason being is that that's not what it feels like. I mean, if you're, the listeners have just got to think, what does it feel like when I'm excited or frightened or when I'm thinking hard about something? It doesn't feel like there's anything going on in your head. It feels in your body. It's in your body. That's where if you're frightened, then your stomach starts churning. If you're excited, then you feel it in your body. You're not a brain in a vat. You are a brain in a body. You are this whole thing, and your body is incredibly important. So if you're looking for some kind of location for emotion, thought, and so on, then you'd locate it in the heart. I mean, various cultures have located in other places like the liver and all sorts of bits and bobs of the body. But if you were wanting to locate it, which isn't necessarily a thing, I spent quite some time, most of it got cut from my book, but I spent quite some time reading kind of anthropological material. And one of the interesting things is that I could find no references in studies of Aboriginal Australian ideas to anything about the brain at all, or thought, or the heart even.
So where did they locate it?
Well, that's the point. They wouldn't. Why would you do that, man? If your whole worldview is that you and the land and the dream time, which is also part of the cosmos, are all connected. Why would you have this crazy idea that you as an individual, you are an individual and you are separately in some way entombed in some part of your body? You wouldn't think that, and they didn't.
So there isn't a location because it is it is the web of connections, whatever, that makes up the mind.
It is everywhere. You are part of this interconnected world, right?
Maybe there is more truth to that than so let's return to that. Let's put a pin on that and return to that in the end. But before we do, let's just assuming we're trying to locate the mind anywhere.
Mhm.
Let's do your top 3 findings in history where someone did something which wasn't just, someone sitting in an armchair and being, oh, I think it's in the head, but where we actually discovered something new which pushed understanding towards this odd idea that there is something really special about the head rather than the heart.
Well, the starting point, the best thing, and it's a very gruesome one, was an experiment, and it was an experiment, but it was also a demonstration done by Galen, who is generally known as the codifier of what passed for medicine in the West for about 1500, 1700 years.
And so now we are in the kind of first couple of centuries after year 0 in the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And he was born in what is now Turkey. He was ethnically Greek, but he was a Roman citizen. He was also a very important person. I mean, he was a poet and a philosopher, had one of the biggest libraries in Rome, etc., etc. And he was convinced that the location of thought, or at least of control of the voice, which is he can use as a proxy for consciousness, was the brain. And he came about this partly by he used to work as a physician in the arenas where gladiators would, if they got damage to the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, then they could no longer speak. And this nerve connects the voice box to the brain. And you can damage this if you play contact sports like rugby and other things. You can lose your voice by damaging this nerve. Anyway, Galen was convinced that therefore it was the brain, and he wanted to convince his various opponents, who argued like everybody else, that it was the heart. I mean, that's what Aristotle had argued, and it was all fairly obvious because the heart moves and the brain doesn't, right? So how can you have ideas and emotion coming from something that is inert? It doesn't seem to make any sense.
Oh, that's an interesting point. It's not only that the brain doesn't feel like anything, but it also doesn't look like it's doing anything.
It just sits there. It just
so
sits
like
there.
Aristotle said, it's just cooling the blood, right?
What else would it be doing? I mean, it's very hard to imagine. And Aristotle, of course, we're smiling at him, but he was one of the smartest people who ever lived,
And a good biologist. I think he was the first person in known history to realize that whales are not fish. I mean, that's a non-trivial finding.
No, all his books on animals are mind-boggling. You read them and you are just blown away by quite how clever he was. However, in this particular instance, he made a mistake. So Galen, to convince his opponents, plural, he carried out an experiment. This wasn't so much an experiment, it's a kind of public demonstration where a group of them got together with a pig, and the pig's alive, not very happy. This is where it gets unpleasant, because the pig is going to remain conscious, whatever that is for a pig, throughout this. And he says to his opponent, he says, okay, you think that the heart is the origin of all emotion and would ultimately control the voice, then let's see. So they open up the pig, and the pig, as you might imagine, is squealing away. And Galen then says to his opponent, right, put your hands around the heart, hold it, stop it from beating, which he does. And of course, the pig can carry on squealing, at least for some time. It doesn't do anything instantaneous. So Galen then, I mean, whether this is on the same pig or another one is rather unclear, they open the skull of the animal. So they've had to get some chisels. You've got to think about quite how horrible this would have been. They get a chisel to open the skull, and then Galen presses down on the brain. And of course, instantly, the animal stops squealing. It becomes unconscious. And when he removes his hand, after a short time, the pig recovers. And so for Galen, this demonstrates the role of the brain in control of the voice. Now, you said come up with 3 things that, were brilliant experiments and changed how we think. This is a brilliant experiment which changed nothing. Because why would you believe that? Okay, that might be true for pigs squealing, but hey, man, when I'm excited, my heart beats. I'm not going to change my mind. So it wasn't like the scales fell from their eyes. I mean, as far as we can tell, most people around the world for millennia carried on thinking what they'd always thinking, either nothing about where their ideas might come from, or if they did sit down and think about it, then it was coming from the heart, almost certainly. It didn't actually change anything because of the weight of experience. I mean, it is a bit like the sun and the earth.
Yeah, so it just feels like the sun rises and the sun falls. It does not feel like we are making a loop. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, we get Copernicus, we get Galileo, etc. That's the Earth and the sun story. What about with the brain versus the heart story?
Well, there's no heart-centric moment. There's no apple falling from the tree. There's no Galileo getting the telescope and pointing it at Jupiter and suddenly seeing these new stars, which are Jupiter's moons. There's none of that. Instead, it's just a slow accumulation, and partly it was anatomy. So in the same year that Copernicus's book is published, 1543, Vesalius publishes his Anatomy of the Body. Now, this wasn't the first time that somebody had done a detailed anatomy of the body, but it was glorious. It's in 7 volumes. It's got fantastic woodcuts illustrating the bits of the body, and there's a whole volume devoted to the brain, and he dissects it. And what he shows is that it is just unbelievably complicated.
Yes, so it isn't just a cooling system which moves not.
Yeah, it's not just a cooling system, or as William Harvey, shortly after, about 70 years later, demonstrated, that the heart is a pump. And once you think that, you think, okay, well, I get what it's doing. It's squidging. It's a rather weird pump, but that is actually what it is.
It's not a speech originator generator.
Doesn't seem to do any of those things. It just goes tung, 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 all the time until you're dead. And but the brain, on the other hand, turns out to be unbelievably complicated. So you could, this kind of good reason to think, okay, we got pump on the one hand, doesn't look like it's going to do something amazing apart from pump stuff. And then we got this, oh my God, just unbelievably complicated, convoluted structure in our heads. So that looks kind of a bit more convincing. People became, throughout the 18th century, growingly certain, until by kind of halfway through the 18th century, certainly learned people thought, well, there's something in the brain.
Am I right that around the time of that Shakespeare is writing, the debate is in the air?
Yeah, Shakespeare in, what is it? I've forgotten which play is it? I got the book here. Merchant of Venice. Here we go. It's Act 3 of the Merchant of Venice. Somebody's doing a dance and they say, tell me, where is fancy bred? Fancy being the imagination, or in the heart, or in the head. So what this shows is that Shakespeare, he knew that these clever people were arguing about this. Is it in the heart or is it in the head? And furthermore, he knew that the groundlings, or the people who are standing up in the theatre and are going to throw rotten turnips at the actors if they don't like it, they would get this too. But it shows that we don't actually know this. But by the 18th century, basically this is resolved, but there's no particular reason for that.
Would there be a particular, if you think that, first one is Gale and second one is the anatomy, would a third one be the way that you start having very systematic studies on how damage to a certain, not just damage to the brain, but damage to a certain brain area systematically causes you to lose this mental function, that brain damage causes you to lose that function, and that becomes like you start seeing the architecture of the mind and the architecture of the brain, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that already there was an argument in the 18th century. If you damage parts of the brain, then you would see changes in mental function, and that this was seen as being causative and therefore part of the supporting evidence for this slow shift towards a brain-centric view. And during the 19th century, well, from the end of the 18th century, this became popularized in phrenology, this pseudoscience whereby it was claimed that the brain was composed of different organs, and that the shape of these organs or the size of these organs reflected different personality characteristics, and that you could then detect this by feeling the outside of the skull. So you'd get people feeling your skull and they go, oh, you've got a big lump there, you must be very clever, or whatever, all right? Now, this is clearly nonsense because your skull's, the brain isn't composed of lots of lumpy organs. 2, your skull is incredibly thick, which is why you can bang your head and not die. And there's no way that the shape of your brain is reflected in the shape of your skull. But this was widely believed. So this is a bit like astrology, right? So it's widely believed, it's popular science. Queen Victoria believed in it. Karl Marx would phrenologize his new comrades when he met somebody. Are you trustworthy? Yes, you've got a good lump back there. In the first time that Sherlock Holmes meets Moriarty, and clearly this is fiction and written in the 1880s, but Sherlock Holmes meets Moriarty, his great rival and who's very dismissive of Holmes's intellectual abilities. Moriarty makes a sneering remark about the shape of Holmes's head, reflecting his ignorance. So this is phrenology, and it carries on for about 150 years. But the point is that because it's a pseudoscience and because it is so decried by the scientific community, there was a real problem when, in about the 1850s, evidence did emerge of a systematic link between brain structure and function. This was even more problematic because it took place in France. And the French have very French ideas. And one of them came from Descartes, which is that the mind is unitary. You can't split the mind into different bits. It's a unitary whole. Therefore, the brain is too. So although the brain clearly has different areas, if you look at it, and it's kind of in 2 copies of itself on either side, when you look at it, in using French logic, because Descartes says the mind is unitary, then the brain must be as well. So there is no localization of function. People are absolutely convinced of this because Descartes. This eventually revolved around what I'm doing now, speech, again. Bit like going back to Galen. And a chap called Broca, who was a surgeon, who was absolutely convinced that there was no localization of function. He ended up, he had a series of patients in the hospital that he was working in Paris who had strokes. And if they had a stroke, sometimes they lost the power of speech. And doing dissections on these patients afterwards, he noticed that when they had lost the power of speech, then they always had a lesion in the front left part of their brain.
In a place that we know now as Broca's area.
Broca's area. So, I mean, poor Broca, he's shafted because it's really interesting. Any scientist who's, as I have, discovered data that they don't like, and the data don't go away, and you find yourself in a corner, you can't escape the data. And Broca ended up saying, look, their language, the production of language, is localized in this front part of the brain. So this then led people to be in a way, this says, well, okay, so maybe those phrenologists weren't so crazy after all. Maybe there is localization of function, which everybody has said, nope, that can't be. A, it's phrenology. B, Descartes. And this argument is there localization of function, carries on down to the present day, because it is and it isn't. The vocalization, Broca's area, shows us this. Just recently, a paper was published which was co-produced between a series of people doing brain scans and a patient who was only a patient because she was a volunteer in their experiment. She was absolutely normal. She was in her mid-30s. She wrote to the scientists saying, I hear you're doing brain scans. I've been told my brain is quite interesting. They said, well, come on in. Shove her in the machine. And she's a mother, she's a college graduate, absolutely normal. And they look at the scan, and one half is brainy, and the other half, the left side, black, empty. There is nothing in her skull, completely empty. The left side of her left hemisphere of her brain is completely gone.
She has only half a brain.
She has only half a brain and is utterly normal, and she can speak perfectly normally. So Broca's area, you can watch YouTube videos of this. If you get a big magnet and you put it next to somebody who's speaking, the left-hand side of the brain, then I mean, I've never done that.
Really?
Yeah, it's quite
So
safe.
you could do this at home and it's safely.
Well, I think you need a very powerful electromagnet, and I
Okay.
really wouldn't do it just because it doesn't seem right. But, you know, I mean, alcohol does the same thing. I don't know if you ever noticed. So, the brain can be affected by all sorts of drugs and magnets. Anyway, and this is the interesting thing, when she was in the womb, so before she was born, she had a stroke, and this led to the death of the left-hand side of the brain.
But so her brain kind of reorganized because she was so young, and instead of using the thing that we call Broca's area, well, it found a new place. But it probably did find a place to...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this shows that is there localization of function? Yes, but it's also distributed and can, in certain circumstances, show plasticity.
Yes, but I do think we can see the forest from the trees. I mean, just the fact that we find all of these, even if it's a bit messier picture than the kind of Broca's area equals speech generation. Okay, you can relearn things if you're born with half a brain and all of these things. Yes, but it's still pretty clear that brain is the scene of a lot of, poking at the brain, you poke at the mind, and to the Descartes point. I mean, of course, the wildest, weirdest things in probably the history of neuroscience is when you literally do cut the brain into half. You're not born with only half a brain, but you're born with a brain, and some surgeon comes and splits the bridge between them, the corpus callosum, and as far as we can tell, there seems to be, in a sense, two minds. The hands can fight each other, in extreme cases. Those are weird. We don't need to go deep into that whole split brain.
Well, I mean, it is there's two things to say about this. Firstly, this is the most extraordinary, as one scientist said when this was reported, he said, great, now I've got two things I don't understand instead of just one. But more importantly, this discovery was made in the late 1950s when patients with intractable epilepsy were being treated by having the two halves of the brain separated surgically.
So that the seizure doesn't go from the left to the right. Or
yeah,
the right.
So this would these people whose lives were just not worth living. And so in desperation, they said, okay. I mean, so it was all done for the best reasons with their knowledge and acceptance. It wasn't a horrible, brutal experiment at all. It was done for the best of reasons. And discovering that there's something weird going on required very, very complicated experiments. And it turned out that the left-hand side of the brain, which controls speech, that had certain views, and the right-hand side of the brain, which can't control speech, so can't talk to you, that had other views, or you could stimulate it in certain ways. One of the examples was you'd show patients pictures of a nude, and this was done in such a way that only the right half of the brain could perceive it. So the left-hand side of the brain, which can, if you said, what am I showing you? It would say nothing, because it can't see. The right-hand side of the brain could see this nude, and then made the body laugh. So you then say to the person, you say, why are you laughing? They then make up some crap, something like, oh, your machine's kind of funny. And they have no idea. They do not know what the other side of the brain has seen. So this is just mind-boggling. We still don't understand. What it says, which in a way is what we know, right, is that in some mysterious way, the neurons of the brain, or parts of the brain, some of the neurons of the brain, act together and produce consciousness, whatever that is. And if you separate them, then they have slightly different characteristics.
It is mind-boggling. But you did say something very important there. You said in some mysterious way. And I think that the mystery is something that we should talk about. Before we do, just one more thing about this kind of the way that it becomes more and more obvious to both scientists and the popular culture that the brain is the center, in some sense, of thought, of consciousness, of feeling, even if it doesn't feel so, would probably be drugs. And not only, recreational drugs, from alcohol to LSD, but also, I think, in the popular culture, perhaps most importantly, antidepressants. SSRIs. I mean, you don't have to have a psychology degree to know that there are these pills that have something to do with serotonin, which is something to do with the brain. and that has something to do with depression. What that something is, well, that's very mysterious. But would it be right to say that the discovery of these chemicals in the brain, serotonin, and the other ones that people are often familiar with, dopamine especially, that the discovery of these neurotransmitters, of their role and the way that we can manipulate them and sometimes even treat people by that, this happens post Second World War. Would it be right to say that that's maybe the last kind of big change in our understanding of the brain that becomes part of the popular understanding also?
Yes, in that it is very important. So these drugs are all discovered really in the 1950s and a little bit in the 1960s. And that in itself tells us something quite worrying. That is that there hasn't been any since, and there won't be, because no drug company is trying to solve the mental health crisis by developing new drugs, because it is so difficult. They got very lucky very quickly with a handful of drugs, but the exact mechanisms that are involved are very unclear. But this idea of these chemicals, these substances that we can alter by ingesting something, and that will then bring us back into balance, has struck a chord with the public. But the fact that the drug companies are not investing in this, I mean, that tells you they are not going to pass up a quick buck, that's for sure. Or even a complicated buck. They don't see that there is any way forward in any of the treatments that have been developed. They're as good as they're going to get. There's no theory coming or results coming out of neuroscience which is suggesting, hey, this is the solution. If anything, it's saying, hey, it's much more complicated than you think. And those are the kind of problems that we face. And it is really, it's really difficult for anybody who's suffering or who has anybody in their family who's suffering from the various mental health problems that we're more aware of. We are kind of stuck. And, I mean, it in a way, it's even worse than the antibiotics crisis, right? We know that we're running out of antibiotics because the microbes are evolving, all the rest of it. But, we can imagine all sorts of ways, even by using AI to try and work out what a new antibiotic would look like. I don't think there's anything equivalent even to that kind of speculative futurology of pharmacology.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that people in the field are most excited about now is literally mushrooms. There's even one US state where I think that they've now pretty much finished the track of training psilocybin-assisted therapists. And I guess LSD has been around since, 50s. Of course, mushrooms, they were around before us. And we don't really understand what that does to the brain. But I mean,
No. But then we don't understand what much does to the brain.
Exactly. Really. Let's look at that. I think it's not just that there is this one ballpark in neuroscience where we don't exactly know what's happening, and therefore we're stuck with treating mental health with chemicals. But you make, I think really well, you make the point that there's actually almost no part of neuroscience where we would really be knowing what's going on. And I think that in a profound way, and I think that by far the best demonstration of this has nothing to do with the brain, but with similar cells operating, 30 neurons operating in the stomach of a lobster. So let's talk about the lobster stomach.
So this is the work of Eve Marder from Brandeis University in Boston, Massachusetts. And she has spent the whole of her life, the whole of her academic life, studying the lobster's stomach. So the lobster and various other crustaceans have a bag, stomach, which produces two rhythms to grind up its food. And it produces two different rhythms, and it has 30 neurons that produce those two rhythms. And Professor Marder knows absolutely everything about these neurons. She knows their connectivity, she knows their origin, she knows the genes that are expressed in them, all the chemicals they're bathing in. So she knows absolutely everything. And she can model it. You can put all this data into a computer. And she is unable, as of today, as far as I understand it, unless a result is coming out that I don't know about, she is unable to explain why those 30 neurons produce those two rhythms and not others, because sometimes she can find evidence that a different rhythm could be produced and yet it isn't, nor is she able to predict what will happen to the activity of those 13 neurons if she removes any particular neuron surgically? And she's got a model, and the rhythms do not add up.
So let's just make sure we understand the gravity of the problem. There are people out there, very serious people, very good scientists, who talk about modeling the human brain, for example, in a simulation. The human brain has closer to 100 billion neurons.
And other cells.
And other cells, and the dopamines and the serotonins that we don't understand, whatever. And by the way, that brain, as you said earlier, is in a body, and that body is in an environment. But anyway, that's tens of billions. That's like, this is literally astronomical. This is the kind of number we can only imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine by imagining universe with full of stars and galaxies full of stars. In the lobster's stomach, there are 30 neurons, and we can simulate them on a computer, and we still don't understand what's happening.
Yeah. Now, in one way, this isn't surprising. So physicists have something called the three-body problem.
Yes.
Which is when if you've got two bodies moving in random directions, you can interpret their interactions. You add a third one, and they give up. Their computer can't. So, physicists got there first, right? But we've got 30 neurons, and we don't know what they're doing.
But how fundamental is this? Because of course, despite the three-body problem, we can do a pretty good job at predicting all sorts of things with probabilities. Like we can predict the weather, despite there being significantly more than three things influencing the weather. We can land on the moon. We can send the Hubble telescope. We can build modernity, despite the fact that, if you try to model it atom by atom, you don't really understand. If we would try to model the Earth atom to atom, we would get completely lost. So we don't. We take these bigger pictures, and then we can do pretty good meteorology and climate science. We're not completely lost just because we couldn't build it from absolutely the ground up. So, and I think that there are any claim about we can build the human brain from the ground up with not only each neuron, but also the glial cells and the chemicals and all of that. That, to me, I think that the lobster stomach is a wonderful reminder of, hold on a second, this is, not only are we not 10 years away, not only are we 100 years away, I mean, it's just not within our kind of realm of understanding necessarily in any future that we can kind of conceive of. But is there a way in which, does that mean that we are lost? Because there could be people who say, yeah, just forget about the individual neurons, study the brain waves, the bigger patterns that emerge, the gamma waves, the theta waves. We have all sorts of fancy science around those things. You could put a cap on and, music-looking things come up on the computer screen of the neuroscientist. I participated in countless studies like that when I was an undergrad. And I look funny with a silly cap on, and something happens on the screen, and these people are learning something. So this was famously also the point of David Marr, one of the most significant, perhaps, kind of cognitive scientists of the 20th century, who said that forget about if you want to understand the calculator, don't start with the atoms or the bits. Try to understand mathematics first and see how that machine is able to implement mathematics. Start from the math. Don't start from the atoms. And that was his point with the brain also. Don't start from the ground up. Start by thinking of some kind of a code, almost like a neural code. Is that a more fruitful path forward? If we cannot build it from the neurons up, is there a way in which we can understand the brain by looking at it from the big picture, like we understand the climate or the weather?
Well, like you say, Marr certainly thought so. And he was heavily influenced by and worked very closely with Francis Crick. I've just finished, I'm about to publish a biography of Crick.
By the way, for listeners, in case you don't know, so Francis Crick was one of the two people credited from the discovery of DNA, of the double helix structure of DNA.
But the double helix structure.
The double helix structure of the DNA.
And they did discover it. Nobody else did. Which is just the case. So Crick, in the second half of his academic career, he turned to the study of neuroscience, which is something that he'd outlined in 1947. He said, I want to understand two things. I want to understand the nature of life and the nature of consciousness. And so that's basically what he did for the next, until 2004 when he died. And he worked with Ma. Ma had leukemia, died very young, 36, I think. And his work was on vision and was extremely influential. But although his ideas are very still, he's still very influential. On the other hand, it did not lead to a breakthrough in understanding of human vision or either of artificial models of vision. And what's interesting is that after Ma's death, in and around San Diego, which is where Crick was working, there was a movement developed called Parallel Distributed Programming, PDP, which was the idea that you would build neural nets, very simple neural nets, maybe 30 components.
Simulated on the computer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all simulated on computers, on early Macintoshes generally. And
these are psychologists mostly, right?
Well, they're psychologists and mathematicians.
Okay, but I think this is really interesting, given where the story will land. It starts from trying to understand how the brain and the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. No, very much so. This is the point they're trying to do. They're building these models, basically, of various high-range things. One of the most successful versions of programs that they produced was a program to learn past tenses in English. And as you will know, in particular, I guess, that the English past tenses are fine. If you're a native English speaker, you don't notice. But if you are learning the language, then it gets really difficult. You don't say I go, you have to say I went. And you've got these are irregular verbs of the past tense. And children make this mistake as well when they're learning. And one of the fascinating things was this program. Not only could it learn over a period of time, but it was making the same mistakes that children learn. So that was very exciting, right? And people got very excited. And this is, they end up producing 2 volumes, so about 1,000 and 1,200 pages of chapters of articles that people had published. This group of researchers based around San Diego, around the Cognitive Science Department in UCSD and at the Salk Institute. And Jeffrey Hinton was one of the people involved and John Hopfield, who was not based in San Diego, but elsewhere in America. And they, as people may know, recently won the Nobel Prize, because this is in fact the origin of today's LLMs, large language model.
Of ChatGPT and DeepSeek and etc.
You can trace it all back to this work on PDP.
It was quite interesting. I was, when I was an undergrad in, I think in 2015, I was in psychology labs where we had to build that very past tense learning networks.
Okay, well, there you go.
So I remember poking at the 30 nodes and, trying to build. I think I did a pretty bad job. I don't think it model really worked, but.
So this book sold over 50,000 copies, which is just mind-boggling. For an academic book. It's not only library. Clearly, there aren't 50,000 libraries. Individuals are buying them. But what's interesting is that very soon, this approach, which seems so fruitful and was supposed to be wasn't primarily being done by computational scientists. They were wanting to understand the brain.
Yeah.
The basic structures involved in their models were no longer biologically valid. They started using things that worked and produced the amazing results we have today, although they don't understand how their systems work either. But they were not biologically valid because they included something called back propagation. That is that the neurons could run 2 ways, which some neurons in some organisms can do, but in general, a neuron only goes one way. But the heart of these LLMs is this back propagation, this taking the information, the output straight back into the system and altering what your next step in your iteration, which is gradually going to improve your performance. And I'm afraid I'm going to mention him again. Crick was all involved in this. Crick was part of the PDP. But he gets very, very irate at meetings on brain science that are taking place in the late 1980s. Because the models that people are getting very excited about are not biologically accurate. And indeed, he points out at the time, we knew virtually nothing about the fine detail of the wiring of the human brain at all. I think the point is that yes, fair enough. We don't need to be able to simulate all the cells or start necessarily from a cellular basis, but the basic structures of these models, if they're to be useful for understanding the brain, need to correspond to that. If they work brilliantly, but aren't based on neuroanatomical reality, then I'm not sure what we're looking at. But it's amazing, but it's not necessarily a model for the brain.
By the way, let's continue on this the brain is a mystery question in a moment, but this is not the first time. I learned this from your book, that this is not the first time when psychology, neurobiology, neurology inspired a computer revolution.
Yeah. So the computers that we use today, which are all built on what's called von Neumann architecture, that was designed by John von Neumann in 1945. And his pitch to the American government to get them to pay for his project to build this big computer, which was made out of valves because there were no transistors at the time. His pitch was, I'm going to build you a computer based on the brain because I know how the brain's wired up. Because 2 years earlier, these two people called McCulloch and Pitts put together their neurological knowledge and the ideas in logic, which were circulating at the time, which had also influenced or were influencing Alan Turing. And they said, look, nervous systems are wired up such that there is logic. They call their paper the immanent logic of the nervous system.
But this is all a mind game in a sense. This is how it could work. And it turns out to be completely false.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, when I was writing the book, I talked to a pal who's a very high up neuroscientist in the States. And I said to her, did you ever read McCulloch and Pitts? And she said, never heard of it. And so I sent it to her, and she just, within a day, she sent it back and just says, one load of rubbish.
Yeah,
because nervous systems are not wired up like that.
Yeah, but the irony is that this becomes the inspiration for the computer in the same way these machines learning the past tense of English like children do. Oh, actually, this didn't work like the brain. This doesn't tell us much about the brain. But it does give us ChatGPT. Okay, later on.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So it's quite interesting how this keeps happening. But you mentioned Turing, who was can't remember exactly how he was how close they were with von Neumann, but he's the other big name that comes up.
I'm not sure they ever met.
Okay. But he's the other big name that comes up in this kind of origins of computer science as we understand it. And of course, the thing that he's most famous for is cracking the Enigma code.
I mean, it had largely been cracked before by the Polish mathematicians. Yeah, so he was one of the team. I mean, they did, but I mean, he did play a very important role.
Yeah, and I guess the segue I was gonna say there is that, I think you have a nice line in your book about the fact that if we try to understand the brain, like we have. A lot of us, or a lot of you neuroscientists have since the Second World War, which is as a computer. First, it was the computer with a brain, but of course it goes both ways. Then there is a kind of code. David Marr, who we mentioned before, was trying to say, forget about the precise neurons, try to understand the code. But then, as you point out in the book, if there is a code, there should be a way to crack the code. Like we crack the Enigma code. And you're saying that we haven't cracked it, and we're nowhere near cracking it.
No, well, I mean, I better put my cards on the table. I don't actually study the brain. I have never studied the brain because it's too complicated. I spent most of my academic career studying the maggot's nose, which has just 21 neurons, and I would make a maggot, because these are Drosophila maggots, which just had one functioning smell neuron, and I would try and understand how that single neuron responded to the environment. So I have one of the best things about the book, which came out 5 years ago, is that I don't think anybody's hated it, and that's partly because I'm nice to everybody, and I'm equally doubtful about every single field. I don't have a dog in this fight. All I can do is read the stuff and go, we have no idea, and tell the truth that scientists say in the evening at in the bar at conferences when they get together and they say, I can't explain any of this, you know.
Yeah. Not only can we not understand the human consciousness, but we can't understand the maggot nose.
See, that's the other thing. I'm not actually terribly interested in human consciousness because I don't, from a scientific point of view, because I don't think it's a doable problem. Right. At the moment, there are 200, I think it's 250 theories of consciousness. Somebody listed them and grouped them together into different types. Now, if this was in any other field, you would say, you don't know what you're measuring. You don't even agree. You're not looking at this from the same point of view. You know, you're the blind people standing around the elephant. None of you have any idea, simply because otherwise you'd only have 3 theories. You wouldn't have 250. That's just crazy, you know. So my view on consciousness is that it is real, that it emerges from the brain. It is soluble in anesthetics. So that's interesting. How that works, nobody's any idea. Anybody who's going to go under the knife tomorrow, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Human Brain Project was launched, what was it, 2013? And it was I think it was €1 billion that the European Union pumped into it. And my impression of it, correct me if I'm wrong, my impression is that it's a little bit again like the von Neumann thing. It's again like the this PDP leading into ChatGPT and whatnot, is that there is a lot of computer science advances that have come from it because they're trying to simulate. They promise that by 2020, they would be, if they have the right computers, they will be able to simulate the whole human brain.
So they had to buy a lot of computers and build them. And that was really what it was all about. I mean, a lot of us got very angry at the time. You know, there were petitions in Nature about this being a waste of money, or not a waste of money. It was a waste of neuroscience money. And the people who are driving it were computer scientists, not neuroscientists.
And the idea would be that, you know, in the way that some sci-fi ideas say that one day we'll upload our brain to the computer, it will be, well, actually, we're going to do it in 2020, in a sense, because there will be an actual simulated computer, a little bit like the lobster stomach, but not 30 neurons, all of those neurons. Plus, also, of course, like you said many times, it's not just the neurons, but, you know, let's bracketing that aside, what did they accomplish by 2020?
Nothing.
I think they did something with mouse.
Yeah, they did have a tiny little bit. So there's part of the mouse's brain which relates to its whiskers, which are really important for a mouse. And so they modeled a tiny little, I mean, it wasn't even I can't remember what size it was, microns maybe. I mean, it's very small. A mouse's brain is only about that big, you know, so it's about the size of a big peanut, you know. So this tiny little part of the brain to do with the whiskers. And yeah, it didn't fall over, it didn't crash, which I think is the best thing you can say about it. I mean, you know, there have been studies of this, and it has produced advances in computation. I mean, and it's kept a lot of people in work, but its insight in neuroscience, I think, is 0, which was predictable. And so, as I said, a lot of us got very cross at the time. And there were petitions, articles, letters to Nature. Goodness me, you know, we got very annoyed. But the EU carried on and spent the money. And I have colleagues who, not in a neuroscience department, in the computer department, who did very well out of it and built some fancy equipment. But I don't think it told us anything about how brains work.
Yeah. Well, before we finish, I have 3 questions.
Okay.
One is about the mystery, the remaining mystery. Is there something lurking under the hood here? Because it's true that when we look at this kind of, cracking the code of the brain or simulating the brain in the computer, this all seems to be like, it's not going to happen next decade. It's not going to probably happen next century. But one of the most remarkable things that has happened to do with brain science is that you have people who cannot see or who cannot hear or who cannot move, who, because of the combination of robotics and neuroscience, are able to do those things. And these are very moving things. The videos about these things are incredibly moving. They're very real. And they are with us, and they do feel like, wow. I mean, those are the moments where I feel the kind of wow, like we are living in the kind of march forward of scientific success.
So the most frequently used one is that relatively simple, and that's cochlear implants. So people who are congenitally deaf can have implants that enable them to hear. You can watch, heart-rending, tear-jerking videos on YouTube with, babies who for the first time can hear through their implant. Now, that's relatively simple, but even that is really, really complicated. And the experience of people with these implants is that you need to learn to hear, because it's not just like, okay, I switch it on and bingo, I can hear normally. Your brain then has to make sense of it, especially if you've never heard anything before. Then you've got to make sense of this new stimulation. It's very, very
But
complicated.
it's still a really remarkable scientific advancement, which couldn't happen without us understanding how the brain works.
Well, understanding aspects of peripheral sensory activity. But this is all very clunky kind of industrial level machines at the moment. We're not yet getting to micro devices that people who are tetraplegic can then, have attached to them and start to do things every day. I don't know anybody who's having everyday experience of this. I mean, my view of all this, like with, genetic engineering and all the rest of it, is that it's going to be much more of a niche thing than we tend to imagine, certainly for the decades and decades to come in my lifetime. And maybe in 100 years, it'll become much more, it will be miniaturizable and scalable and safe and et cetera, but we really aren't there yet, because although we do have that very simple grasp of what's going on, our big grasp, which is what you've got to have if you're sticking electrodes in your brain to control activity or receive information, then you really need to know everything. You're not going to get them poking around my brain, thank you very much, unless we know a lot more. Tell me about the lobster's stomach is what I'll be saying to Elon Musk. If you can't do that, hands off.
Well, second to last question. We started with you mentioning his Australian Aboriginal ideas where you don't locate consciousness, mind, whatever. You don't mislocate it perhaps in the heart, but neither do you locate it in the brain. You just don't locate it. And like there is a branch of cognitive science, neuroscience. I guess inactive cognition would probably be the key word for people who want to go deeper into that, who sees that there is a way in which it is a mistake that we, the scientific community, we modern people, whoever, try to locate the mind in the brain. So yes, the brain is doing a lot of interesting, important stuff, but it's maybe more like a bottleneck phenomenon. You break a part of the brain, the things don't flow through. But the mind, the person, the soul, the consciousness, whatever, is actually in the flow between the environment, the brain, the body. The brain is a bottleneck there. But to really understand the mind, we shouldn't try to understand just the brain. We should try to understand the organism in the world. What do you think of that?
I think that the real answer is we are interacting with the world and responding to it and making inferences as about the world. And as Kenneth Craik, the Cambridge psychologist, said, we're making models of the world. We're trying to predict what will happen. But it's still, despite that connectedness, it's only cells, as far as we know, that can do that. It's only neurons, and it's only certain kinds of neurons. Now, which are those neurons that produce consciousness? Are they unique to the human brain, or are they unique to the primate brain or the vertebrate brain, or are they common to any brain? Do my maggots with their 10,000 neurons, do they have something like a mind in the same way, in a way that is sensible, to use the same term as for me? I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I was very kind of hard-nosed behaviorist and would say, no, they're just machines. And now I've got a bit more hippy-dippy in my old age, and I'm happy to talk about a mind in a maggot. I don't know what that means, but I'm happy to imagine that there is some quantum of similarity. There's a dimension there which becomes multiple. There are dimensions which then multiply between a maggot and me, but there's also some element of commonality. But that's the mystery. That's the problem. And as I explained in the book, this isn't the first time, not knowing how it works. This isn't the first time we've been here. I mean, any time that anybody's thought about this, they've gone, I don't know. Or you come up with an argument like Descartes, which some perfectly respectable scientists like Sir John Eccles have said, yeah, there is a non-material substance or an immaterial substance, which is the soul, mind, and that is not produced by neurons. I think that's cobblers. And all the evidence we have goes in the other direction. How it works, however, which are the neurons that are doing it? Are they particularly located somewhere? Do they fire in a particular way? We don't know. And that, I've been, one of the reasons why I wrote a biography of Francis Crick was that while I was writing this book, my impression had been before I started was that I knew I'd written about Crick's work on molecular genetics, that when he'd gone off to California, he went to solve consciousness. Ho, ho, ho. Well, that's a joke. And then to my great surprise, when I was researching the book, I discovered that in every one of the modern chapters, the present half of the book, except for the one on neurotransmitters, Crick was popping up. And he was there. He was having ideas. He was thinking about these things. And this was what he argued. He argued that the strategy to understand consciousness was to try and work out the neural correlates of consciousness, where these neurons are that correlate with our conscious perception. Visual perception was what he was interested in. Now, we've done that to an extent in that we can identify certain neurons that will fire in an individual very reliably when you present them with a particular visual stimulus, and they report seeing a picture of the Sydney Harbour Bridge or, famous film star or whatever. Jennifer Aniston was one of the ones they used. A single cell would only fire if it saw Jennifer Aniston. So we've actually got there what Crick wanted. We've got. What does it tell us? Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but there is something about those neurons in certain parts of the brain, in certain ways in which they're connected, which somehow produces this impression, this the qualia, the experience of the vividness of me seeing you. That experience, in some way, they're produced by that activity. And I can't say any more than that. And we haven't been able to say any more than that since, Descartes said, well, it's in the ether, man. And other people went, nope, it's not. And I don't know what more to say about it than that. It's just mind-boggling, which is why I don't study it. Because I don't, to answer your question, I don't think we have the tools. And this is also partly the theme at the end of the book. And whilst I absolutely take your point, I don't think it's necessary for us to solve the lobster's stomach before we solve consciousness. On the other hand, it does represent a major challenge.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a good place to come to the final question, which is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
Yes, that is the one question to pull the curtain back for the listeners. That's the one question you told me you would ask. So I had a chance to think about it, and I didn't know how to answer it, and I still don't. People are very, very clever, right? That's the one thing. Again, that's partly why I wanted to write this biography of Crick, because when you're studying something, you know quite a bit about it, and then you read a research paper by somebody. It might be by Eve Marder, it's not necessarily by Crick, but somebody who's clearly much cleverer than you are and has made brilliant insights, which are always partial. But how did they do that? How did they make that step? How were they able to think that thing? Aristotle, right? Okay, great. So he's there on his island, dissecting squid or whatever he was doing. But even so, reading Aristotle, I recently, the book I'm writing, which is going to be called The Idea of Heredity, which is how long it took us to understand that there was such a thing as biological heredity. Spoiler, it doesn't really happen until the kind of 17th, 18th century. And Aristotle doesn't have a word for it. But you're not allowed, as I say in the book, and used to say to my students, you are not allowed ever to say that people in the past were stupid or their ideas were stupid. You can't say that. They're much smarter than you are. You only know the stuff you know because you've learnt it. You haven't found anything out, right? Most of us don't ever find out anything out of any importance. We've learnt it. And I think the future, they're going to look back at us. They're going to go, why didn't they see it? Maybe it's staring us in the face, right? But there's something we don't get. And I'm not sure it's just a matter of getting more data. I think we need ideas Because that's what science is, right? Yes, that's it. So we're amazingly clever, but also a bit dumb sometimes and can't see what's facing us. No. In particular, me. I mean, if I don't go a day saying how stupid I was because I didn't get something, then that's not good.
Matthew Cobb, thank you so much for your great book. The name of the book is The Idea of the Brain, and for all your time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great fun.
Okay, so that was it for today's episode with Matthew Cobb, and also for the 5-episode series on the human brain. If you haven't checked out the other episodes, you'll find them in the feed right before this. And as always, if you like the episode, do subscribe to the show if you haven't done so yet. Do give it a 5-star review if you think that I deserve it, and do share this episode with a friend if you think that they might enjoy it. Until the next time, take care.